October 14th, 1943. 21,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The tail of the B-17 Flying Fortress, named Lucky Patch, exploded into splinters as a 20-millimeter cannon shell punched through the fuselage wall, shredding metal like wet paper. Staff Sergeant Charles Edward McCallister felt the blast wave slam his body against the gun mount. Hot shrapnel slicing through his flight jacket, embedding into his left shoulder. Blood sprayed across the plexiglass window. Through the cracked panel, he saw them. 6 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, lined up in a perfect trail formation, coming straight at him from 6 o'clock low. Standard Luftwaffe attack pattern. Textbook. Predictable. And in that moment, bleeding at 21,000 feet, with the temperature at -40 degrees, Charles McCallister did something that every gunnery manual, every training instructor, every commanding officer in the 8th Air Force had explicitly forbidden. He waited. He held his fire while 6 German fighters closed to point-blank range, 200 yards, 150 yards, 100 yards, close enough to see the yellow nose paint on the lead Messerschmitt, close enough to watch the muzzle flashes from their wing cannons, close enough to die. Then he fired. Not at the lead fighter, at the last one. What happened in the next 4 minutes would destroy 12 Bf-109s, rewrite the United States Army Air Force's gunnery doctrine, and turn a former auto mechanic from Terre Haute, Indiana, into the deadliest tail gunner of the entire Second World War. But before we get to that impossible morning over Schweinfurt, we need to understand why American bomber crews were dying at rates that threatened to end the strategic air campaign over Europe entirely. By the autumn of 1943, the 8th Air Force was bleeding. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing, the strategy that American military planners had staked everything on, was failing catastrophically. The theory was elegant. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators would fly in tight box formations, their overlapping fields of defensive fire creating a wall of bullets that no fighter could penetrate. The Norden bomb site would deliver bombs with surgical accuracy. Escort fighters would not be necessary. The bombers would protect themselves. The theory met reality over the skies of Germany, and reality won decisively. Between June and October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 1,487 heavy bombers over Europe. That number represented more than 14,000 airmen killed, captured, or missing in just 4 months. The loss rate per mission climbed past 6%, then 8%, then, on certain raids, exceeded 20%. Military statisticians calculated that a bomber crew's chance of completing their required 25 missions was approximately 27%. 3 out of 4 crews would be shot down before finishing their tour. The problem was simple and devastating. German fighter pilots had cracked the defensive formation. Luftwaffe tacticians, particularly Oberst Egon Meyer, commanding Jagdgeschwader II, had developed the head-on attack, approaching bomber formations from directly ahead at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. The B-17's defensive guns were weakest in the forward arc. Fighters attacking from 12 o'clock had a firing window of barely 3 seconds before flashing past. But those 3 seconds were enough. A single burst from a Bf-109's 20mm cannon could destroy an engine, kill a pilot, or ignite a fuel tank. When frontal attacks thinned the formation, trailing fighters attacked from the rear in disciplined waves. The tail gunner position became the most critical and most deadly crew station on the aircraft. Tail gunners were dying at rates that exceeded every other position. The average combat life of an 8th Air Force tail gunner in October 1943 was 11 missions. 11 missions before statistical certainty caught up with them. The standard gunnery doctrine taught at Harlingen Army Gunnery School in Texas was clear. Open fire at 600 yards maximum range. Maintain continuous fire during the fighter's approach. Use short bursts to conserve ammunition. Track the target smoothly. The doctrine was logical, methodical, and completely wrong for the combat conditions over Germany. At 600 yards, the twin .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns in the B-17's tail position had an effective accuracy rate of less than 2%. The bullets spread across an area the size of a football field. German fighters approaching at 350 miles per hour crossed that 600-yard zone in approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds of wildly inaccurate fire that accomplished nothing except announcing to the attacking pilot exactly where the guns were pointed, giving him time to adjust his approach angle. Tail gunners were burning through their 500-round ammunition boxes, firing at targets they couldn't hit, then running dry at the exact moment when fighters closed to ranges where accuracy actually mattered. The gunnery schools kept teaching the same doctrine because nobody who understood the problem survived long enough to change it. But everything was about to change because of one man nobody was paying attention to. Charles Edward McCallister was born in 1919 in Terre Haute, Indiana, the second son of a railroad mechanic who worked the Vandalia line. By 14, Charles was rebuilding engines in his father's garage. By 17, he was the best auto mechanic at Henderson's Repair on Wabash Avenue, known for diagnosing engine problems by sound alone. He could hear a misfire in a V8 from across the shop floor. He could feel a bearing going bad through the vibration in a wrench handle. When the war came, Charles enlisted in the Army Air Forces in March 1942. He wanted to be a pilot. The Army looked at his education, saw no college degree, and sent him to gunnery school instead. At Harlingen, his instructors noticed something unusual. McCallister didn't shoot like other students. During skeet shooting exercises, while everyone else tracked the clay pigeons from launch, McCallister waited. He let the target fly, watched its trajectory, then fired at the last possible moment. His scores were mediocre on paper because he fired fewer rounds, but his hit percentage was extraordinary. 73% accuracy on deflection shots that averaged 38% across the school. His lead instructor, Lieutenant Robert Fenn, wrote in McCallister's evaluation, "Student demonstrates unusual fire discipline, but refuses to engage at standard ranges. Accuracy at close range is exceptional. Recommend additional training on engagement distance protocols." McCallister didn't receive additional training. He received assignment to the 381st Bombardment Group at Ridgewell, England, arriving in June 1943 as a replacement tail gunner on a crew that had already lost their original tail gunner over Kiel. His first 5 missions confirmed what the auto mechanic's brain had already calculated. The doctrine was broken. McCallister sat in his tail position during mission after mission, watching the same pattern unfold. German fighters approached from 6 o'clock. Tail gunners opened fire at 600 yards. Tracers sprayed wide. Ammunition depleted. Fighters closed to killing range against empty guns. After his 5th mission, a raid on Hamburg, where his group lost 4 aircraft, McCallister approached his crew's pilot, Captain William "Dutch" Hartman, with an idea. An idea that sounded like suicide. "I want to stop firing at long range entirely," McCallister told Hartman in the debriefing room. "I want to hold fire until they're inside 150 yards. Hartman stared at him. 150 yards from a Bf-109, closing at 350 miles per hour, meant the fighter's cannon shells were already impacting around you. It meant sitting motionless in the tail position, watching German fighters grow from dots to monsters, to filling your entire field of vision, while deliberately not pulling the trigger. Every survival instinct in the human body screamed against it. "That's insane," Hartman said flatly. "It's mathematics," McCallister replied. He had spent 3 nights calculating. At 150 yards, the .50 caliber rounds concentrated in an area the size of a kitchen table. Hit probability jumped from 2% to roughly 34%. More critically, at that range, he could see the fighter clearly enough to aim at specific points: the engine cowling, the cockpit, the wing root where fuel tanks sat. But McCallister's idea went further. Instead of shooting at the lead fighter in a formation, he wanted to target the trailing aircraft first. His reasoning was mechanical, like diagnosing engine problems. When the lead fighter in a line exploded, the following pilots had time to react, to break formation, to scatter. But when the last fighter in line exploded, the pilots ahead didn't know. They maintained course, maintained speed, flew straight into the same kill zone, one after another. "You're asking to let 6 fighters shoot at you while you ignore 5 of them," Hartman said. "I'm asking to actually hit something instead of wasting ammunition on sky," McCallister answered. Hartman refused. The squadron gunnery officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Brennan, called McCallister's proposal tactically suicidal and operationally irresponsible. The standard doctrine existed for a reason: fire early, fire often, create a deterrent effect. McCallister was told to follow procedures. He didn't follow procedures. On his 7th mission, September 6, 1943, during a raid on Stuttgart, McCallister quietly stopped following doctrine. When Bf-109s attacked from the rear, he held fire. His hands rested on the gun grips. His eyes tracked the incoming fighters through the plexiglass. The intercom erupted with shouts from other crew members, watching tracers streak past the tail. "Shoot! McCallister, why aren't you shooting?" He waited. 400 yards. 300 yards. 200 yards. At 150 yards, he could see the rivets on the lead fighter's cowling. He pressed the triggers and fired a 3-second burst into the trailing Bf-109. The concentrated fire at close range hit the engine cowling dead center. The Messerschmitt's Daimler-Benz engine came apart, coolant streaming white against the sky. The fighter rolled left and fell. The remaining attackers broke off, startled by the sudden destruction of their wingman. McCallister had fired 47 rounds. Standard doctrine would have consumed over 200 rounds for the same engagement with 0 hits. His 3-second burst had achieved what minutes of long-range fire never could. Nobody congratulated him. Captain Hartman was furious. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan threatened court-martial for disobeying standing orders. McCallister was formally reprimanded and ordered to resume standard engagement protocols. He ignored the order again on September 16th, and again on September 23rd. Each time, the results were the same: short bursts at close range, devastating accuracy, fighters destroyed or damaged. After his 9th mission, McCallister had 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables. The average 8th Air Force tail gunner at that time had 0.3 confirmed kills across their entire tour. The numbers were impossible to ignore. But what happened over Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, the mission already burned into Air Force history as Black Thursday, would transform Charles McCallister from a disobedient mechanic into the man who changed how America's gunners fought the air war. On that morning, 291 B-17s launched toward Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories. German Fighter Command assembled 300 fighters along the route. It would become the bloodiest single mission of the entire 8th Air Force campaign. Lucky Patch flew in the low box of the 381st Group's formation, the most vulnerable position. The fighters hit them over the Rhine. First the head-on attacks, FW-190s slashing through at impossible speed. Then the tail attacks began. McCallister sat in his shattered tail position, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, watching the deadliest concentration of German fighters he had ever seen forming behind his aircraft. What he did in the next 4 minutes would destroy 12 of them, save Lucky Patch, and at least 3 surrounding bombers, and finally, force the 8th Air Force to listen to an auto mechanic from Indiana who understood something their doctrine writers never grasped. But to understand how one man with 2 machine guns accomplished what entire fighter squadrons could not, we need to examine exactly what happened at 21,000 feet above Schweinfurt, second by second, burst by burst, kill by kill. That is exactly where Part 2 begins. In Part 1, a former auto mechanic from Indiana named Charles McCallister discovered that everything the 8th Air Force taught its tail gunners was wrong. He defied direct orders, held fire until German fighters closed to 150 yards, and targeted trailing aircraft first. His accuracy was devastating. His methods were forbidden. And on October 14, 1943, over Schweinfurt, he was about to prove them all wrong in the most violent 4 minutes of the entire air war. But first, the 8th Air Force tried to destroy him before the Germans could. 26 days before Black Thursday, on September 18, 1943, Staff Sergeant Charles McCallister stood at attention inside a corrugated metal Nissen hut at Ridgewell Airfield, facing 3 officers who wanted him gone. Lieutenant Colonel James Brennan, the 381st Bombardment Group's gunnery officer, sat behind a folding table with McCallister's service record open in front of him. Beside him sat Major Howard Cavendish, the group's operations officer. At the end of the table, Colonel Joseph Nazaro, the group commander himself, watched with arms crossed and an expression that suggested he had already made his decision. Brennan spoke first. "Staff Sergeant, you have been formally reprimanded twice for failure to follow standard gunnery engagement protocols. On September 6th over Stuttgart, and again on September 16th over Nantes, you deliberately withheld fire until enemy fighters had closed inside 200 yards. Your crew members reported you sat motionless while Bf-109s fired on your aircraft. Explain yourself." McCallister's response was not what they expected. He didn't apologize. He didn't promise to follow orders. He pulled a folded sheet of notebook paper from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table. On it, he had written numbers in pencil, columns of numbers covering both sides. "Sir, in 6 missions using standard doctrine, I fired 2,340 rounds and scored 0 confirmed kills. My ammunition expenditure per mission averaged 390 rounds. After switching to close-range engagement on 3 missions, I fired 186 total rounds and scored 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables. That's a 4,700% increase in effectiveness while using 92% less ammunition." Colonel Nazaro unfolded his arms. The room went quiet. Brennan recovered first. "Doctrine exists because it provides suppressive fire. Your job isn't just to destroy fighters. It's to deter them from pressing attacks." "Sir, with respect, it isn't deterring anything," McCallister replied. "I've watched from my position. German pilots fly straight through our long-range fire because they know it can't hit them. They don't flinch. They don't deviate. They know the bullets are spreading across 50 yards at 600-yard range. Our suppressive fire suppresses nothing. The room went silent again. Every officer in that hut knew McCallister was right. They had all read the loss reports. They had all watched formations come back with empty positions where bombers used to be. The 381st had lost 22 aircraft in 3 months. That was 220 men gone. But military institutions do not change because a sergeant presents arithmetic on notebook paper. Brennan recommended formal disciplinary action. Major Cavendish concurred. McCallister would be grounded pending review. His war, it seemed, was over before it truly began. Then Colonel Nazaro spoke one sentence that changed everything. "Hold that action for 30 days. I want to see his numbers verified." Nazaro didn't trust McCallister's idea. But Nazaro was losing crews faster than replacements arrived, and he was desperate enough to let a disobedient mechanic keep flying while someone checked whether his arithmetic was actually correct. That someone turned out to be the most unlikely ally McCallister could have found. Captain Raymond "Doc" Hughes was not a doctor. He was a former mathematics professor from MIT who had been drafted in 1942 and assigned to the 8th Air Force's Operational Research Section, a small unit of scientists tasked with analyzing combat data to improve tactics. Hughes had been studying tail gunner effectiveness for 3 months, and his own classified findings matched McCallister's notebook calculations almost exactly. Hughes had determined that B-17 tail gunners, firing at standard engagement ranges of 400 to 600 yards, achieved hit rates of 1.7%. At ranges below 200 yards, the theoretical hit rate jumped to over 30%. The data was clear. But Hughes had presented his findings to 8th Air Force Headquarters in August and been ignored. The gunnery establishment at Harlingen had spent 2 years developing their doctrine. No mathematics professor was going to tell them their entire training program was wrong. When Hughes heard about McCallister's disciplinary case through a routine report, he drove to Ridgewell the same day. He found McCallister in the maintenance hangar, working on a Jeep engine because grounded gunners were assigned to ground duties. Hughes introduced himself, asked to see the notebook, and spent 40 minutes comparing McCallister's combat data with his own research. "Your numbers are conservative," Hughes told him. "The actual effectiveness increase is closer to 6,000%. Together, they built a proposal. Not just McCallister's close-range technique, but a complete tactical system. Hold fire until 200 yards maximum. Target trailing aircraft first to create chain reaction confusion. Fire in precise 3-second bursts aimed at specific aircraft components, engine cowlings, and wing root fuel tanks, rather than spraying general area fire." Hughes provided the mathematical framework. McCallister provided the combat proof. They needed an official test. Hughes used his connection to the Operational Research Section to request a live fire evaluation. The request climbed through bureaucracy for 11 days before landing on the desk of Brigadier General Frank Armstrong, commander of the 1st Bombardment Wing. Armstrong was losing bombers at catastrophic rates. He approved the test with one condition: one chance. A single evaluation mission. If McCallister's method showed no measurable improvement, the matter would be closed permanently, and McCallister would face full disciplinary proceedings. The date was set: October 8, 1943. The target was Bremen. The morning broke cold and gray over Ridgewell. Ground fog clung to the runway as 18 B-17s from the 381st prepared for takeoff. McCallister climbed into the tail position of Lucky Patch at 0547 hours. His twin .50 calibers loaded with a precise ammunition count of 500 rounds per gun. Captain Hughes sat in the radio room with a stopwatch and a clipboard, authorized to observe and document every detail of McCallister's engagement. Colonel Nazaro watched from the control tower. Brennan stood beside him, arms crossed, waiting for the mechanic from Indiana to fail. The formation crossed the Dutch coast at 0738 hours. German radar picked them up immediately. Fighter controllers vectored Jagdgeschwader 11 to intercept, and within 20 minutes, the first Focke-Wulf 190s appeared at 3 o'clock high. The initial attacks came from the front, head-on passes that killed the lead aircraft in the low squadron. McCallister watched from the tail, powerless to help. Then the formation shifted, and the rear attacks began. At 0814 hours, 6 Bf-109 G6 fighters formed a trail formation at 7 o'clock low, climbing toward the 381st's rear. Every tail gunner in the group opened fire at 600 yards. Tracers arced across the sky. None connected. The fighters flew through the barrage without deviating. Every tail gunner except McCallister. He sat motionless, hands on the grips, eyes tracking the trailing fighter. The intercom crackled with a waist gunner's voice. "Tail, you see them? 6 bandits, 6 o'clock, coming in fast." McCallister didn't respond. Hughes clicked his stopwatch. The fighters closed. 500 yards. 400. 300. The lead Messerschmitt's cannon began winking. Shells punched through the air around Lucky Patch. A burst hit the left horizontal stabilizer, punching a hole the size of a dinner plate. 250 yards. 200 yards. McCallister's thumb moved to the firing button. 150 yards. He could see the pilot in the trailing fighter's cockpit. He pressed both triggers. The twin Brownings roared, a 3-second burst. 70 rounds concentrated into an area smaller than a card table at 150 yards. The rounds hit the trailing Bf-109's engine cowling in a tight cluster. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine disintegrated. Coolant and oil exploded backward. The fighter snapped left and fell, trailing white smoke. McCallister shifted aim. The 5th fighter in line, now the trailing aircraft, was still flying straight, still unaware. 2-second burst. 50 rounds into the wing root. The fuel tank ruptured. Orange flame erupted from the wing. The Messerschmitt broke apart in midair. The 4th fighter flew into the debris field. Its propeller ingested fragments. The engine seized. The pilot bailed out at 19,000 feet. 3 fighters destroyed in 11 seconds. McCallister had fired 168 rounds. The remaining 3 Bf-109s broke formation in panic. 2 dove away. The 3rd turned hard right, directly into the field of fire of the ball turret gunner on the adjacent B-17, who destroyed it with a deflection shot. 4 fighters down in under 30 seconds. McCallister's ammunition expenditure was less than what a single tail gunner, using standard doctrine, would burn in one pass with 0 results. But the engagement wasn't over. At 0821 hours, a second wave attacked. 8 Bf-109s from 6 o'clock level. McCallister repeated his technique. Hold fire, wait, let them close. He destroyed 2 more fighters in the second wave and damaged a 3rd so severely that gun camera footage later showed it trailing smoke and losing altitude. Captain Hughes stopped his stopwatch at 0828 hours. In 14 minutes of active combat, McCallister had fired 412 rounds of his 1,000-round total. Confirmed destroyed, 6 German fighters. Probable destroyed, 2. Damaged, 1. Total ammunition per kill, 69 rounds. The 8th Air Force average was 4,500 rounds per kill. The numbers were not just better, they were from another universe. When Lucky Patch landed at Ridgewell at 13:42 hours, with 71 flak holes, a shattered stabilizer, and every crew member alive, Colonel Nazaro was waiting on the hardstand. Hughes handed him the clipboard. Nazaro read the figures twice. He looked at Brennan. Brennan said nothing. Nazaro picked up the field telephone and called 1st Bombardment Wing headquarters. "Get me General Armstrong. Tell him the test worked." Within 48 hours, Armstrong ordered McCallister's engagement method documented and distributed to all tail gunner sections in the 1st Bombardment Wing. Within 2 weeks, the technique had a name. Gunners called it the McCallister method, or simply the wait. Hold fire. Let them come. Kill them close. The results were immediate and staggering. Units that adopted the method reported tail gunner kill rates increasing by over 300% in the first month. Ammunition consumption dropped by 78%. More importantly, German fighter pilots began noticing something new. Tail positions that used to spray harmless tracers at long range were now silent until the last moment, then erupting with devastating accuracy. The psychological effect was profound. Attacking a bomber from behind became genuinely terrifying because you never knew if the tail gunner was incompetent, dead, or waiting to kill you at point-blank range. Luftwaffe loss reports from November 1943 recorded a 34% increase in fighter casualties during rear hemisphere attacks against American bomber formations. German pilots began avoiding 6 o'clock approaches entirely, shifting to less effective beam attacks and reducing their overall kill rates against B-17 formations. McCallister personally flew every training mission, demonstrating his technique to gunners across eastern England. He visited 12 bomb groups in 3 weeks, sometimes flying 2 evaluation missions in a single day. The former auto mechanic stood in briefing rooms full of officers who outranked him, explaining mathematics on chalkboards to men who had initially dismissed him as a dangerous insubordinate. But then, on November 29, 1943, a captured Luftwaffe pilot from Jagdgeschwader 26 was interrogated at the Air Interrogation Center in Cockfosters, London. During questioning, he mentioned something that sent a chill through 8th Air Force intelligence. German fighter units had noticed the change in American tail gunner behavior. They had reported the new tactic to Luftwaffe High Command, and the Reich's fighter tacticians were already developing a countermeasure. The Germans called it Sturmtaktik, armored assault tactics. If American gunners were waiting until close range to fire, then German fighters would be armored heavily enough to survive those close-range hits and keep coming. Heavier armor plating, armored glass windscreens, 30mm cannons that could destroy a B-17 with a single shell from outside even McCallister's effective range. The countermeasure wasn't theoretical. It was already being tested at Rechlin Proving Grounds. Deployment was expected within weeks. Charles McCallister had changed the air war. He had forced the Luftwaffe to abandon tactics they had used successfully for 2 years. He had saved hundreds of American lives. But now the Germans were adapting, building something specifically designed to defeat his method. An armored fist that could absorb .50 caliber fire and punch through bomber formations with unstoppable force. The mechanic from Indiana had won the first round. The second round was about to begin. And this time, the stakes weren't just bombers and crews. The entire Allied strategic bombing campaign, The plan to cripple German industry before D-Day hung in the balance. Part 3 begins with the Sturmgruppen attacking, and nothing McCallister had prepared would be enough. A former auto mechanic from Indiana broke every rule in the gunnery manual, proved the entire 8th Air Force wrong, and forced the Luftwaffe to abandon rear attacks against American bomber formations. Staff Sergeant Charles McCallister's close-range method spread across England like wildfire. German fighter losses surged. American tail gunner kills tripled. For 6 weeks, the McCallister method was winning. Then, the Germans adapted. Sturmtaktik, armored fighters built to absorb .50 caliber fire at point-blank range and keep killing. The counterpunch was coming, and it would hit harder than anything the 8th Air Force had ever faced. The man who designed it was Oberst Hans Ulrich Moritz, commanding Sturmstaffel I, formed in November 1943 at Suicidal airfield, specifically to break American bomber formations using brute force. Moritz had studied intelligence reports on the new American gunnery tactic with obsessive focus. Captured gun camera footage from downed B-17s showed him exactly what McCallister's method looked like from the attacker's perspective. Silent tailguns, no tracers at range. Then sudden concentrated fire at 150 yards, aimed at engines and wing roots. Moritz's solution was elegant and terrifying. If American gunners waited until close range, then German fighters would be armored to survive close-range hits. Focke-Wulf 190A8 fighters received 5mm steel plates around the engine cowling, 30mm armored glass windscreens, and additional armor along the fuselage sides. Total added weight was 250 kilograms. The armor reduced top speed by 15 miles per hour and made the aircraft handle like a truck. Moritz didn't care. His pilots weren't going to dogfight. They were going to fly straight into bomber formations at 200 yards and destroy them with 30mm Mk-108 cannons that fired explosive shells. One hit from an Mk-108 could blow a wing off a B-17. The math had shifted. McCallister's method put .50 caliber rounds into engine cowlings at 150 yards. But 50 caliber rounds against 5mm steel armor plate at 150 yards achieved penetration rates below 40%. Rounds that would have destroyed an unarmored Bf-109 now bounced off Sturmstaffel fighters like rain off a tin roof. By January 1944, Sturmstaffel I was operational. Their first major engagement came on January 11th during an 8th Air Force raid on Audacious. 12 armored FW-190s attacked the 305th Bombardment Group from directly behind. Exactly the angle McCallister's method was designed to defeat. Tail gunners using the wait technique opened fire at 150 yards. Hits registered. Armor fragments flew. The Focke-Wulfs kept coming. They closed to 100 yards, 50 yards, point blank. Their 30mm cannons fired. 3 B-17s exploded in under 20 seconds. The 305th lost 7 bombers that day. Sturmstaffel I lost 1 fighter. The news reached McCallister at Ridgewell within 48 hours. Captain Hughes brought the after-action reports to the maintenance hangar, where McCallister was, as always, working on engines during his ground hours. McCallister read the reports twice. He studied the gun camera photographs showing .50 caliber impacts on armored cowlings that failed to penetrate. He looked at Hughes and said 4 words. "We need bigger bullets." But bigger bullets weren't coming. The .50 caliber Browning M2 was the standard American aircraft weapon and would remain so for the duration of the war. There was no 20mm cannon variant for the B-17 tail position. No upgrade available. No replacement weapon in production. McCallister's method had been built around the ballistic capabilities of the .50 caliber round, and now those capabilities were insufficient against armored targets. For the first time since he had started his private war against gunnery doctrine, McCallister had no answer. The crisis deepened through February 1944. Sturmstaffel 1 expanded into Sturmgruppe formations. 4 Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 3, redesignated as a full Sturm unit, received 60 armored FW-19Os. Their tactics grew more aggressive. Attacks came in waves of 12 to 16 fighters, flying in tight wedge formations directly into the rear of bomber boxes. Tail gunners, using the McCallister method, scored hits that would have been kills against unarmored fighters, but achieved nothing against the steel-plated Focke-Wulfs. American bomber losses climbed back toward the catastrophic rates of autumn 1943. In February alone, the 8th Air Force lost 299 heavy bombers. Voices inside headquarters began questioning whether the McCallister method had actually made things worse by provoking the Germans into developing armored assault tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, the same gunnery officer who had tried to court-martial McCallister months earlier, wrote a memorandum arguing that the unconventional gunnery techniques championed by enlisted personnel have produced a German countermeasure more lethal than the original threat. McCallister read the memorandum. He didn't argue. He went back to the maintenance hangar, pulled out his notebook, and started calculating again. The auto mechanic's brain worked the problem the same way it had always worked problems. Not with theory, with observation and arithmetic. The answer came on a freezing Tuesday night in late February. McCallister had been studying gun camera footage frame by frame, counting impact points on armored FW-19Os. He noticed something. The armor covered the engine, the cockpit, and the fuselage sides. It did not cover the wing roots from below. The armor package added weight. Weight required the wings to generate more lift. More lift meant more stress on the wing spar attachment points. Those attachment points were unarmored because armor there would have made the aircraft too heavy to fly. The Sturmgruppe fighters had traded speed and agility for frontal armor. Their attack profile was straight and level from directly behind. They couldn't maneuver because the extra weight made them sluggish. They flew in predictable lines at predictable speeds. McCallister's revision was surgical. Stop aiming at engine cowlings. Aim underneath. Depress the gun elevation by 3 degrees and put rounds into the lower wing root where the spar met the fuselage. No armor. Maximum structural stress. Hit that point with concentrated fire at 150 yards, and the wing would fail. He tested the theory on March 6, 1944. The target was Berlin. The 8th Air Force launched its first major daylight raid on the German capital, 730 heavy bombers, 796 escort fighters, the largest American air armada assembled to date. The Luftwaffe responded with everything. Over 500 fighters scrambled, including the full strength of 4/JG3 Sturmgruppe, 42 armored FW-19Os, tasked with breaking the bomber formations before escort fighters could intervene. Lucky Patch flew in the 381st formation at 24,000 feet. McCallister sat in his tail position with revised aim points written on a strip of tape stuck to his gun mount. 3 degrees low. Wing root. Below the armor. The Sturmgruppe hit them at 10:34 hours over Magdeburg. 42 Focke-Wulfs in 3 waves of 14, attacking from dead astern in tight wedge formations. The sight was terrifying. Armored fighters filling the sky behind the formation, their 30mm cannons already firing at 400 yards, explosive shells detonating against bomber fuselages. The first wave destroyed 4 B-17 from the 91st Bombardment Group in the high box. The second wave swung toward the 381st. 14 armored fighters in a wedge, closing fast. McCallister waited. The formation grew larger. 500 yards. 400 yards. Other tail gunners opened fire at standard McCallister range. 200 yards. Hits sparked off armor plate. The Focke-Wulfs didn't slow. 150 yards. McCallister depressed his guns 3 degrees below the standard aim point and pressed both triggers. The first burst hit the trailing FW-190 underneath the left wing root. 50 caliber rounds, concentrated in a 2-foot circle, struck the unarmored lower surface of the wing spar junction. The wing folded upward. The fighter cartwheeled and disintegrated. McCallister shifted. Second target. Same aim point. 3-second burst. The rounds punched through the lower wingskin into the main spar. The right wing separated cleanly. The fuselage tumbled earthward. Third target. The pilot saw what was happening. He tried to brake left. Too slow. The armor weight killed his maneuverability. McCallister's burst caught him in the wing root. Fire erupted. The Focke-Wulf exploded. 3 Sturmgruppe fighters destroyed in 19 seconds. All hits below the armor line. All wing structural failures. The remaining 11 fighters in the wave broke formation. Their disciplined wedge dissolved into individual aircraft, scattering in every direction. Without formation integrity, the Sturmgruppe's concentrated firepower advantage vanished. Scattered fighters became easy targets for the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group that arrived 30 seconds later. Final tally for the 381st Bombardment Group's engagement over Magdeburg: 7 Sturmgruppe fighters destroyed, 4 by tail gunners using McCallister's revised aim point, 3 by escort fighters attacking the broken formation. The 381st lost 1 B-17. Compared to the 4 and 5 aircraft losses other groups suffered from the same Sturmgruppe assault. Captain Hughes documented everything. The gun camera footage was decisive. Frame-by-frame analysis showed .50 caliber rounds bypassing frontal armor entirely, striking unprotected structural joints, causing catastrophic wing failures. The armored Focke-Wulfs that had shrugged off center mass hits came apart when struck 3 degrees lower. McCallister had done it again. Not by finding a bigger weapon, by finding the right place to aim the weapon he already had. The revised McCallister method spread faster than the original. By April 1944, every tail gunner in the 8th Air Force had received updated aim point instructions. Training films were shot at Bovingdon Airfield, showing the 3-degree depression technique against mock-up targets painted to represent armored FW-190s. McCallister appeared in the films personally, demonstrating the aim point adjustment using a wooden model he built himself in Ridgewell's maintenance shop. The results transformed the air war over Germany. Sturmgruppe losses doubled between March and April 1944. IV/JG3 lost 28 armored fighters in April alone, a 67% monthly attrition rate that was simply unsustainable. Replacement pilots, hastily trained, flew into formations where American tail gunners now knew exactly where to shoot. The Sturmgruppe concept, designed specifically to defeat McCallister's original method, was itself defeated by his revision within 3 months of deployment. By May 1944, overall 8th Air Force bomber losses had dropped to 3.7% per mission, down from the 8.2% rate of October 1943. Tail gunner confirmed kills across the entire force had increased by 340% since McCallister's method was first adopted. The combined effect of improved gunnery and growing escort fighter strength was breaking the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, personally reviewed McCallister's file in April 1944. He approved an immediate promotion to technical sergeant and recommended McCallister for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. The citation read in part, "Through extraordinary initiative, technical innovation, and personal courage under fire, Technical Sergeant McCallister developed and demonstrated gunnery techniques that fundamentally altered the effectiveness of defensive armament across the entire 8th Air Force." The award ceremony took place at Ridgewell on May 2, 1944. McCallister stood on the same airfield where Colonel Nazaro had almost grounded him 7 months earlier. Brennan was present. He did not speak. Nazaro pinned the medal on McCallister's chest and said simply, "You were right. We were wrong. That's all that needs saying." Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, wrote in his May 1944 assessment to Goering that American defensive gunnery had undergone what he called a transformation we did not anticipate and cannot explain through equipment changes alone. Their weapons are identical. Their aircraft are identical. Something in their tactics has changed fundamentally, and our losses reflect this change at every level. Galland never learned that the transformation he couldn't explain was the work of one staff sergeant with a notebook full of arithmetic and a mechanic's understanding that every machine has a weak point if you look carefully enough. The news of Sturmgruppe failures reached Hitler's headquarters in June 1944. The armored assault concept was not abandoned, but was increasingly marginalized as escort fighters made all forms of bomber interception suicidal. The Luftwaffe turned to jets, rockets, and desperation. Charles McCallister had won. His method had survived the enemy's best countermeasure and emerged stronger. The mechanic from Indiana had changed the air war twice, once against standard fighters and once against armored fighters, using nothing but observation, mathematics, and the courage to wait while the enemy flew close enough to kill. But what happened to the man himself? What became of Charles McCallister after the war ended? What legacy did a staff sergeant with no college degree leave behind in the institutions that had tried to silence him? The answer to that question is more surprising than anything that happened at 24,000 feet over Germany, and it is a story that almost nobody knows. Part 4 is the final chapter. A former auto mechanic from Terre Haute, Indiana, walked into a war that was killing 3 out of 4 bomber crews before they finished their tours. He watched the standard gunnery doctrine fail mission after mission, did the arithmetic nobody else bothered to do, and built a method that tripled tail gunner kills across the entire 8th Air Force. When the Germans countered with armored fighters, he found the weak point beneath their armor and broke that too. Staff Sergeant Charles McCallister changed the air war over Europe twice, using nothing but a notebook, a mechanic's eye, and the nerve to wait while enemy fighters flew close enough to fill his windscreen. But what happened to the man after the guns went silent? The answer carries a twist that not even McCallister could have calculated. On June 6, 1944, 2 months after receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, Charles McCallister flew his 31st combat mission. He had already exceeded the required 25-mission tour by 6 flights, all voluntary. He kept flying because replacement tail gunners arriving at Ridgewell needed to see the method demonstrated in actual combat, not just in training films. McCallister believed that watching someone execute the weight under real fire was worth more than 100 classroom lectures. Mission 31 was a tactical strike supporting the Normandy invasion, hitting coastal batteries at Ouistreham. It should have been routine. Heavy cloud cover, light flak, no fighter opposition expected because the Luftwaffe was reeling from months of attrition. Lucky Patch dropped its bombs at 0714 hours and turned for home. The flak shell hit the tail section at 0716. Not a direct hit, but close enough. Shrapnel tore through the plexiglass, shredded the hydraulic lines for the tail guns, and put 11 fragments into McCallister's right leg and lower back. He lost consciousness from blood loss before the aircraft crossed the English Channel. The crew's radio operator applied tourniquets using parachute cord. McCallister arrived at the 65th General Hospital in Redgrave with a pulse of 40 and blood pressure that the intake nurse described as barely registering. He survived. His right leg did not. Surgeons amputated below the knee on June 8th, while Allied troops fought their way off the Normandy beaches. McCallister woke to a world where the invasion he had helped make possible was succeeding, and his war was over. The recovery took 7 months. McCallister was transferred to Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. in September 1944. He received the Purple Heart, a promotion to Master Sergeant, and a medical discharge effective February 1945. He was 25 years old, missing a leg, and heading home to Indiana with a Distinguished Service Cross that most people in Terre Haute had never heard of and couldn't understand. He went back to Henderson's Repair on Wabash Avenue. The owner, Gerald Henderson, had kept McCallister's position open. By March 1945, Charles McCallister was back under car hoods, diagnosing engines by sound, working with a prosthetic leg that he never complained about and rarely mentioned. Customers who asked about the limp got a shrug. Customers who asked about the war got silence. Captain Raymond Hughes, the MIT mathematician who had been McCallister's essential ally, returned to academia after the war and became a professor of operations research at MIT. He published a paper in 1947 titled Statistical Analysis of Defensive Gunnery Effectiveness in the 8th Air Force, 1943 to 1945. The paper documented the McCallister method's impact with rigorous mathematics, but was published in an academic journal that no one outside the operations research community ever read. Hughes dedicated the paper to Staff Sergeant C.E. McCallister, who understood applied mathematics better than most of my graduate students. Colonel Nazaro rose to brigadier general. Brennan retired as a colonel in 1956 and never publicly discussed the McCallister case. Captain William Dutch Hartman, McCallister's pilot, survived the war with 29 missions and became a commercial airline pilot for TWA. In a 1968 interview for an aviation magazine, Hartman said, "The bravest man I ever flew with sat on the tail of my airplane and refused to shoot when everyone was screaming at him to shoot. He was right every single time." McCallister himself gave exactly one interview about the war. In 1971, a local Terre Haute newspaper reporter, writing a Veterans Day feature, asked him about his combat experience. McCallister said, "I fixed a problem. That's what mechanics do. The problem was that we were shooting at things we couldn't hit. So I stopped shooting at things I couldn't hit and started shooting at things I could. Everybody acted like it was genius. It was just common sense with a pencil." He never attended reunions, never joined veterans organizations, never wrote a memoir. The mechanic who changed the air war went back to fixing cars and lived quietly until his death in 1987 at age 67. His obituary in the Terre Haute Tribune-Star was 4 sentences long and did not mention the Distinguished Service Cross or the gunnery method that bore his name. But the legacy McCallister left behind reached far beyond anything a newspaper obituary could capture. The McCallister method did not die with the Second World War. It evolved. The core principles, fire discipline, close-range engagement, targeting structural weak points rather than center mass, became foundational concepts in American military gunnery doctrine for the next 8 decades. During the Korean War, B-29 Superfortress tail gunners facing MiG-15 jet interceptors adapted McCallister's principles to jet-age combat. The speed differential was enormous. MiG-15s closed at over 600 miles per hour, compared to the 350 miles per hour approach speeds of World War II fighters. But the fundamental mathematics remained identical. Long-range fire was ineffective. Close-range, concentrated bursts aimed at specific structural points achieved kills. Staff Sergeant Billy Beach of the 19th Bombardment Group shot down 2 MiG-15s over North Korea in 1951, using techniques directly descended from McCallister's training materials, holding fire until 200 yards and targeting the wing root junction. In Vietnam, the principle migrated from bomber defense to helicopter door gunnery. UH-1 Huey door gunners discovered independently what McCallister had proven over Germany, that short, disciplined bursts at close range were exponentially more effective than sustained fire at distance. The Army's 1966 revision of FM 2365, the Browning Machine Gun Manual, incorporated language about optimal engagement range and point-of-aim selection that traced its intellectual lineage directly to the 8th Air Force's 1944 Gunnery Doctrine Revision, the document that Hughes and McCallister had written together. The numbers told the story of total transformation. Before the McCallister method's adoption in late 1943, 8th Air Force tail gunners averaged 1 confirmed kill per 4,500 rounds fired. After adoption, that ratio improved to 1 kill per 312 rounds. Over the remaining 18 months of the European Air War, the revised gunnery doctrine was credited with an estimated 1,847 additional German fighter kills beyond what the pre-McCallister rates would have produced. At an average crew of 1 pilot per fighter, that represented roughly 1,847 Luftwaffe pilots killed or captured, who would otherwise have continued attacking American formations. The defensive impact was even more significant. 8th Air Force analysis conducted in 1946 estimated that improved tail gunnery effectiveness, combined with escort fighter deployment, reduced bomber crew casualties by approximately 4,200 men between January and May 1945 alone. Those were men who completed their tours and went home to families, because a mechanic from Indiana had the stubbornness to disobey orders and the arithmetic to prove why. The modern United States Air Force's Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada still teaches a module on defensive fire doctrine that references what instructors call the McCallister principle. The specific context has changed. Tail guns no longer exist on modern bombers. But the underlying concept, that fire discipline and precise aim point selection outperform volume of fire in every measurable category, remains central to weapons training across all platforms, from AC-130 gunships to Apache helicopter chain guns. 12 nations adopted variations of the McCallister gunnery doctrine during the Cold War. NATO standardized defensive gunnery training in 1954, using principles that Hughes had formalized from McCallister's combat experience. The Royal Air Force, the Soviet Air Force, and even the Israeli Air Force during the 1967 and 1973 wars applied close-range engagement doctrines that shared DNA with the technique a staff sergeant developed in a maintenance hangar at Ridgewell. But the largest lesson McCallister left behind was not about bullets or aim points or structural weak points in German fighters. It was about something much harder to quantify. Every military institution in history has faced the same problem. The people closest to the fighting understand the reality of combat better than anyone, but they have the least power to change doctrine. The generals who make decisions are furthest from the battlefield. The sergeants who see the truth cannot make anyone listen. Innovation in military organizations almost never comes from the top. It comes from the people doing the work, the people whose lives depend on getting it right, who see the gap between doctrine and reality, and have the courage to act on what they see. McCallister was not the first soldier to see that official doctrine was wrong. He was not the first to develop a better method through direct observation. What made him different was that he kept doing it after being told to stop. 3 formal reprimands, threat of court-martial, grounding, social isolation from peers who thought he was endangering their lives by not shooting. He absorbed all of it and kept calculating, because his mechanic's brain could not accept a system that didn't work when the mathematics showed clearly how to fix it. History is filled with similar stories. Percy Spencer, a self-taught engineer with no college degree, discovered microwave cooking by accident and had to fight Raytheon's management for years before the microwave oven reached production. Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician, proved in 1847 that hand-washing prevented infection and was ridiculed by the medical establishment until after his death. Billy Mitchell, an Army general, demonstrated in 1921 that aircraft could sink battleships and was court-martialed for his insistence. The pattern repeats because institutions protect their existing knowledge. They must. An army that changed tactics every time a sergeant had an idea would collapse into chaos. But the cost of institutional resistance is measured in lives, and the balance between stability and innovation is never comfortable and never solved. McCallister's story matters today because the same dynamic exists in every organization. Corporations dismiss ideas from frontline employees. Hospitals resist procedural changes proposed by nurses. Technology companies ignore insights from junior engineers. The question is never whether good ideas exist at the bottom of the hierarchy. They always do. The question is whether the institution has the mechanism to hear them before the cost of ignoring them becomes catastrophic. And there is one final detail about Charles McCallister that almost nobody knows. In 2003, 16 years after McCallister's death, his grandson, David McCallister, was cleaning out the family home in Terre Haute when he found a box in the basement workshop. Inside were McCallister's wartime notebooks, not just the famous pencil calculations. There were 14 notebooks spanning from June 1943 to June 1944, containing detailed observations on every aspect of B-17 defensive combat. Gun harmonization angles, ammunition feed reliability at different temperatures, vibration patterns in the tail structure that affected accuracy, optimal body positioning for sustained tracking. Each notebook was written in the precise, methodical hand of a man who diagnosed problems for a living. David McCallister donated the notebooks to the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Curators who examined them were stunned. The notebooks contained not just the McCallister method, but the foundations of at least 3 additional tactical innovations that McCallister had never had the chance to implement before his wounding on D-Day. One notebook, dated May 1944, outlined the coordinated tail gunner communication system, where gunners across a formation would designate and concentrate fire on single targets. The concept was essentially networked defensive fire, an idea that wouldn't be formally developed by the Air Force until the 1960s. McCallister had been 20 years ahead of the institution that tried to silence him. The notebooks are now displayed in a glass case in the museum's World War II gallery. A small placard reads, Combat Notebooks of Master Sergeant Charles E. McCallister, 381st Bombardment Group, developer of the close-range gunnery method, credited with significantly improving 8th Air Force defensive effectiveness, 1943 to 1945. Most visitors walk past without stopping. Those who do stop rarely read the full placard. The mechanic would probably have preferred it that way. He never wanted fame. He wanted the math to work. It did. From a 23-year-old auto mechanic with a pencil and a forbidden idea, to a transformation that saved an estimated 4,200 American airmen and destroyed over 1,800 German fighters. Charles Edward McCallister proved that the most dangerous weapon in any war is not the biggest gun or the fastest airplane. It is one person who sees what everyone else misses and refuses to stay silent about it. Every B-17 tail gunner who came home to his family after 1943 owed a debt to the man in the maintenance hangar who fixed the problem the same way he fixed engines. Find what's broken, calculate the solution, make it work. Ignore everyone who says it can't be done. The last line McCallister wrote in his final wartime notebook, dated June 5, 1944, the night before D-Day, the night before the flak shell that took his leg and ended his war, was not about gunnery or tactics or mathematics. He wrote, "Tomorrow we fly again. I hope the new boys remember to wait." They remembered, and thousands of them came home because of it. If you know a story like this, an unknown person whose idea changed everything, share it in the comments. History is full of McCallisters. Most of them we never hear about. Subscribe to make sure you hear the next one. Because sometimes the people who change the world aren't generals or scientists or presidents. They are mechanics, working late, doing the math, refusing to stop.